we're here for Stephanie, and I've been asked to introduce her and forgot my phone with my notes. So here we go. But I do know we met at CHS many years ago. We can't remember when, but we really got to know one another when Steph did half the conference at Kamloops in 2018. There's Master's Defense, run a workshop, presentation about her master's, one after the other, and it was all phenomenal. And now we work together, which is also fantastic. The master's was at Carl Larson's lab, and Christine Bishop, I believe, was a co-supervisor. And then, without my notes, Stephanie now is a conservation planning specialist. I'm going to make it up now. That works for Wildlife Preservation Canada, as well as the Canadian Species Initiative. And the Canadian Species Initiative is affiliated with IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Wonderful. So she gets to do international things. It's quite fun. One of which is be a new NOAA. It's a Wildlife Preservation Canada program. You'll hear a lot from Stephanie, so please come up. Big round of applause. Stephanie Winton.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Hannah. And hello, everybody. I am so excited to be here, very excited to be back at CHS and to be in person because it's been a while. It's been great to catch up with so many of you and to meet new people as well. And I'm really, really happy for this opportunity to be able to share my experiences as Wildlife Preservation Canada's 31st new NOAA. All right, so this trip was a long time coming for me. I was actually selected as the new NOAA in early 2020, which if you can remember back past the black hole that is COVID, we were living in a different world and it was right before the pandemic hit. So unfortunately, my adventure had to be postponed and it wasn't until 2022 that I was safely able to travel to my first destination of the beautiful British island of Jersey in the English Channel. And this is the old Jersey, not to be confused with New Jersey. And you might be thinking, wait, I thought that this talk was going to be about Mauritius, and it is. But first we need to go to Jersey, and that's because of this guy, the late, great Gerald Durrell, author, conservationist, naturalist, zoologist, sort of godfather of modern zoos as conservation organizations. He was really a Darwin of his time, and he traveled to many different places around the world and collected endangered species and brought them back to the zoo that he founded in Jersey, where they acted as insurance populations and sources for restoration back in the wild. And Jerry was passionate about little brown jobs, which I'm sure many of us in this room also share a deep passion for the somewhat forgotten critters. And so now the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Jersey Zoo continue Jerry's vision of conducting conservation-based research on the animals at the zoo, and supporting conservation initiatives that are happening in the countries of origin, including, you guessed it, Mauritius. And so Jerry went to Mauritius many times over the years, and along with fellow conservationist Carl Jones, pictured here, they established some really large-scale conservation initiatives from breeding programs for endangered birds and reptiles to restoration of offshore islands, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and then also training local staff and building local conservation facilities. And so it was through all of this work that they ended up founding the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation. And it was also through pioneering conservation breeding methods by Carl and supported by Jerry that they were able to save several species from extinction, like the pink pigeon. And the Mauritius kestrel, which was recently declared the national bird of Mauritius. This species was saved from only 4 individuals left in the wild before conservation breeding started. So pretty amazing. Jerry also founded Wildlife Preservation Canada back in 1985. And so it's through these long-standing relationships with the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation that almost every year since, COVID black hole excluded, a Canadian biologist has participated in the new NOAA program. And there's actually two other former new NOAAs here tonight, Leslie and Christina. And if there's anyone else that's here that I don't know about, please stand up and wave. But I think Patrick is the only other one. And unfortunately, he's in the Galapagos right now. So yeah. And so the program has changed a bit over the years, but what it looked like, or what it looks like now, is participating in a training program with Durrell, and then heading on to Mauritius and experiencing hand-on conservation work that's happening there. So the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust trains biologists or conservation practitioners from all around the world at their academy that's based right at the Jersey Zoo. And please note that that is not a pink pigeon, it's just a regular pigeon. So myself and 9 other students from Colombia, Montserrat, Brazil, the UK, Nigeria, Madagascar, and Indonesia participated in a 3-month course on endangered species management, where we learned from the experts at Durrell all of the theory and skills that's needed to successfully conserve endangered species. Following this, for most of my fellow students, they went back to their home countries to put those newfound skills to work with the different threatened species that they all work with, the mountain chicken, gorillas, orangutans, lemurs, endangered songbirds, tamarins. But for me, it was time to head on to Mauritius. And there is so much exciting conservation work happening there that I would love to share it with you all, but then we'd never get to the herp quiz, and I know that you're all looking forward to it. So I have 2 tales that I'd like to share that feature little brown jobs of the reptilian variety. But before that, I would just like to set the scene and introduce you to Mauritius, this gem of the Southwest Indian Ocean. So Mauritius, along with Rodrigues and Reunion Island, form the Mascarenes, which is a volcanic archipelago located east of Madagascar. And these are somewhat unique islands in that up until about 400 years ago, they weren't inhabited by humans. And so as these tropical remote islands, they are a hotspot that exhibit high degrees of endemism with over hundreds of endemic species, including a number of Latania palms that are unique to each different island, as well as 12 native species of ebony. The only native mammal found in Mauritius are bats. And so in the absence of terrestrial mammals, there was a radiation of reptile species to fill a lot of the different ecological niches that we might typically associate with mammals in other areas. So that includes grazing and browsing by giant tortoises, pollinating by little geckos, and then predation of other reptiles and insects by snakes and skinks. Mauritius is also home to a family of largely ground-dwelling birds that includes the pink pigeon and its famous cousin, the dodo. And there's also very globally important nesting colonies of seabirds like the red-tailed tropic bird, as well as the beautiful echo parakeet, various passerines like this paradise flycatcher, and of course, the national bird, the Mauritius kestrel, which is the only raptor species. Unfortunately, like most of the world, Mauritius did not escape the ravages of colonization. It was settled by the Dutch, the French, and then finally the English. And in that time that it was occupied by these different groups, the ebony forests were cut down for wood, land was cleared for plantations such as sugarcane. Humans hunted the abundant but naive and easily accessible wildlife. With the humans came other invasive species like rats and shrews and tenrecs, crows, monkeys, even invasive plants. And these had a really detrimental effect on the wildlife. So sadly now, only 2% of the native Mauritian forest remains. And with this habitat loss and the other additional pressures of hunting and invasive species, many of the Mauritian species were driven to extinction. So we're all familiar with the story of the dodo, but there were other Mauritian species that went extinct as well. Other large flightless birds like the red rail, 2 native giant tortoises, a native snake species, and one of those ebony tree species. But fortunately, like I mentioned, there's organizations like the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation and the Durrell Conservation Trust that have been working and have prevented many other species from having the same fate. So they work on many offshore islands around Mauritius. And in one area, this is Maybor Bay that you're seeing. And it's actually the site of the first settlement in Mauritius, as well as a pretty famous battle between the French and the British, which is apparently the only naval battle that Napoleon's armies ever won against the British. So you can see there's an island, I don't know if you can see my pointer, just inside the coral reef that protects Mauritius from the open ocean. And this is Île aux Aigrettes. And it is a nature reserve, and restoration work has been happening here for decades to remove invasive tree species, establish a native plant nursery, and help replant the coastal forest. Those extinct giant tortoises have been replaced with a similar, closely related species from the Seychelles, the Aldabra giant tortoise, in the hopes that it can fill the ecological role from the lost tortoises. So these tortoises graze and browse with their long necks, and they trample vegetation, and they also spread seeds throughout the island in their poop, which is pretty cool. Another part of the island restoration was the eradication of invasive species. So rats were removed from the island, and monitoring is ongoing to ensure that no new invasions can threaten the native wildlife. And through these efforts, a lush forest has been restored, and this island is really a flagship for restoration in Mauritius. And with the habitat restored, other species were reintroduced. This is the Gunther's gecko from Round Island that I spotted during a survey protecting the eggs in this artificial nesting structure. As well as a number of bird species have been reintroduced. This is the Mauritius fody. This little guy was following me during a survey, probably hoping that I would give him some food. Yeah, so there's nothing like sitting on the jetty at night after a long day of checking those invasive species monitoring stations or surveying for geckos and seeing the fruit bats flying in from the mainland to feast on the fruit of the ebony trees, and knowing that that is possible because of the decades of work that has restored this forest. So also in Maybor Bay is a series of 3 islands called the Southeast Islets, and they're actually located at right at the mouth of the pass in through the coral reef. And so they also were heavily impacted by human occupation. But this guy, Dr. Nick Cole, who is the Island Restoration Manager for Durrell and the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, has been working for 16 years on these islands to restore the unique reptile communities. And so altogether, the islands in Maybor Bay hold an unprecedented amount of biodiversity for not only the Indian Ocean, but also the world, because some of these species occur nowhere else. And despite the fact that there's been great success from the recovery efforts, the islands and their wildlife are still at risk from threats. So, an invasion of rats from the mainland is a real possibility. It's very close, and it's maybe less unlikely, but the probability of a potential environmental disaster is highly severe. And this is exactly what happened in July of 2020 when I was originally supposed to be in Mauritius. And since I wasn't there, I'm going to let the folks on the ground tell you what happened.
Our team in Mauritius obviously had to scramble to get the animals off the island once the oil hit them. They had to wear gas masks because the air was so toxic already. The oil was present, so they just had like an hour on the island, take whatever you can and go. Seeing all the hard work being taken away from them for no good reason, really. I mean, devastated for them, devastated for them.
Having the ship crash right on our doorstep is very upsetting. It's very difficult to comprehend, but we've just had to move and take action. And this triggered this emergency rescue of the threatened reptiles that exist on the Southeast Islands. Being on these islands for a couple of hours, it gets a little bit unbearable. It burns your eyes, your nose, and your mouth, so this is a risk.
Decades they've been working on Mauritius. Everything that they've been trying to achieve is at threat. It's a really fragile ecosystem. Some of the rarest species in the world are there. And we knew immediately that we were facing a potential disaster.
Much of the oil gushing from the boat has already...
We knew that given the expertise that we hold here at Jersey Zoo, we are the world's experts at looking after Mauritian reptiles in captivity. We knew we could help, but that meant making a decision about removing some animals from the southern islands. So of course we worked with the government of Mauritius and our other partners in Mauritius to say, can we do this? And if we're going to do it, we need to do it really, really quickly.
We are not trying to save those 60 animals. We are trying to save the species.
Those are the building blocks of any ecosystem. And a zoo like Jersey Zoo, of course, we are dedicated to saving species from extinction. So that's our mission statement. And it's the only mission statement we've ever had in our 60 years history. And we believe this is an expertise to bring to this problem.
This is a female Beja skink that we've just collected from Ile de la Passe. We are going to check its health and condition. And so Ruben is going to measure and weigh the skink and look for any deformities, so we can then compare later on, say in a week's time, whether it's eating enough and whether it's maintaining its health and its body condition. Great.
All right, I'm just going to cut it off there. That video is on YouTube if you would like to watch more. But I will let you know that the teams successfully rescued those 3 species and in the middle of this oil spill and transferred them halfway around the world during a COVID lockdown with a 100% success rate. They didn't lose a single animal. So you really have to hand it to the teams in Jersey and Mauritius for accomplishing such an amazing feat. And I was actually able to go behind the scenes when I was at the Jersey Zoo into the biosecure facility where they are being held. And so I met my first Mauritius reptiles in Jersey. And, coming from a field background and not having a really in-depth knowledge of what goes into the husbandry for long-term care of animals in captivity, I was really impressed with the knowledge and skill that the team at Jersey Zoo has. And, to successfully care for and manage these species, you have to have a really in-depth understanding of their ecology so that you can meet their needs in a different environment. I also had the opportunity to practice handling and processing the species, which came in handy when I was finally in Mauritius. And this was 2 years after the oil spill. And so everything had been cleaned up by then. And, looking at these beautiful turquoise waters, it's hard to believe that the oil spill even happened. But I was headed out with the island restoration team to the Southeast Islets to help with the ongoing monitoring of the reptile populations there to see if any changes could be detected since the oil spill. And so, yeah, we camped amongst the Napoleonic fortifications, and we conducted surveys for Bossiers and Bouton skinks amongst the ruins. And I must say, it was a lot easier to capture them when they were in those nice little enclosures at the zoo than it is to, try and find them in the grass where they can run and hide from you. Yeah, there you go. That's what I was dealing with. But fortunately, I was with a team of lizard catching extraordinaires led by the illustrious Ruben. And so we were able to capture many of these skinks, take their morphological measurements, as well as photos of their dorsal pattern for mark recapture. And you can see that not all of them were super happy about giving up their data. And then at night, we were surveying for that third species of reptile found on the island, the lesser night gecko, and also keeping an eye out for any invasive house geckos. Additionally, we were recording any crab species that we observed because they can be a really good indicator since they're in that intertidal zone. And finally, we were also monitoring the seabird populations that nest on the island. So this is the wedge-tailed shearwater, and these birds provide important nutrients transfer between the marine and terrestrial environments. So they play a really important role. They also have a very unique call that provided a haunting and somewhat comedic soundtrack to my nighttime surveys. So I'm just going to play a snippet for you here. So the shearwaters nest in these ground burrows. So when you're surveying at night, you have to be really careful to not step on any of these and accidentally collapse the entire burrow on top of the bird that could be in there. You also have to be very careful to not get hit in the head when they come flying out of them. So the data from the post-spill monitoring has been compared with the 16 years worth of data from before the oil spill, and changes are evident. So there's been, loss of vegetation on the island, and there's also been a decline in the lesser night gecko populations, and this is most likely due to a decline in their insect prey. I don't think that I saw a single lesser night gecko when I was on the island, to give you an idea. And I know that that paints kind of a grim picture for the future of these reptile populations, but there's still hope because the populations at the Jersey Zoo are a real lifeline for these animals. They're preserving the unique genetic diversity, as well as future options for being able to reintroduce them back into the wild when habitat has recovered and it's deemed feasible. The lesser night gecko is also the hero, if you will, of my next tale, in which we're going to travel from the south of Mauritius up to the north past the northern tip to another famous island, Round Island. Now, when Jerry visited Round Island back in the 1970s, it probably looked something like this. It had been completely denuded by invasive goats and rabbits that were left on the island by sailors as a source of food for when they were passing by. But as we know, goats and rabbits are voracious eaters, and so they essentially almost completely decimated all of the native vegetation. And this led to extreme erosion, which formed these really deep gullies and very limited water retention on the island. Now, Round Island is a closed nature preserve that's managed by the National Parks and Conservation Service, the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, and the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. So you need to have permission to go to the island, and absolutely everything that you bring with you, from your food to your clothes to your equipment, has to go through a really strict quarantine procedure to make sure that you're not accidentally going to bring any seeds or eggs or insects or even some sneaky little house geckos that can invade Round Island. So much like on Ilozikut, the vegetation is being restored. So native plants are essentially head started at a nursery on the island, and then they are planted in what soil remains, and then hand watered for 2 years following the planting to ensure their survival. And through this dedicated work, you can see that the palm forest is slowly starting to make a comeback, and it looks a lot better than it did before. One thing that's interesting about Round Island is that it's one of the very few islands in the world that doesn't have any or has never been invaded by mammalian predators. And so while the vegetation was destroyed, the reptile community persisted. And so there's, a very diverse reptile community, including Gunther's gecko, which is the largest gecko species that we met earlier, and Telfair skinks, which around the field station, these guys are so numerous that you can hardly take a step without them getting underfoot. And they will get into absolutely everything, especially if there is food involved. They have no fear. And I had the rudest wake up of my life one morning when a Telfairs snuck into my tent and had the audacity to bite me on the lip. So cheeky, yeah. There's also a snake on Round Island. It's called the Round Island boa. It is not a boa at all. It's in monophyletic genus. And so it's, very unique in the world. It's really cool. They're bright orange when they're juveniles. They're arboreal, they're nocturnal. But the coolest thing about them is that they have a hinged jaw that enables them to grip their cylindrical prey, which is unique to any wildlife species in the world. That enables them to feast on our friends, the Bossiers and Bouton skinks, and the beautiful ornate day gecko, as well as Durrell's night gecko, named after you-know-who. And so many of these reptiles, because they persisted on Round, have now been introduced to the other offshore islands. But one species that is no longer found on Round are giant tortoises. So the Aldabra giant tortoises were also introduced to Round, and I was telling someone earlier that they had to be airlifted in by helicopter, which apparently also happens in the Galapagos. And in a recent study led by Rose Morehouse-Gann, she used DNA barcoding of all of the plant species on the island to look at the impact that the grazing and browsing from the tortoises is having. And she did find that they are dispersing seeds of some of the native palm species, and so moving them into other areas, which, in time can help the recovery of the palm forest. But she also found that it's not a silver bullet solution to bring in an ecological replacement because the tortoises are doing a terrible job, and I can verify this, of controlling invasive species, such as this prickly sandbur. Those are my legs covered in prickly sandburs, in case you couldn't figure that out. And then another species that's also no longer on Round Island is the lesser night gecko. And so Nick Cole and one of his grad students, Katie Bickerton, have been planning an inter-island gecko translocation for many years to move the lesser night gecko from Gunner's Coin, which is another island in the north of Mauritius, to Round Island. And this northern population is genetically distinct from the one in the southern population. So creating that secondary population is critically important. And Gunner's Coin has actually played an important role in another inter-island reptile translocation. So the orange-tailed skink was found on Flat Island, which is the island located in the distance there. And they were translocated to Gunner's Coin, the island closest to us. And not long after that, a shrew found its way onto Flat Island and completely wiped out the orange-tailed skink population there. So if it hadn't been for the secondary population of skinks on Gunner's Coin, that species would have been lost forever. Now, the first step in introducing the lesser night gecko to Round Island was doing sort of an ecological assessment to make sure that introducing it to habitat where there's a number of sort of top-level predators like our snakes and those bigger skinks and geckos would be something that would be possible, and to make sure that it would fit in an ecological niche. And so I mentioned that Durrell's night gecko is also found on Round Island, and some preliminary analysis found that while they do both predate on moth species, there is clear niche differentiation between the size of species that they prey upon. And so the next step was to ensure that the introduced geckos wouldn't get completely wiped out by the predators before they had a chance to establish. And so unfortunately for me, this is when I joined the island restoration team on Round Island and found myself carrying heavy fencing equipment up steep volcanic slopes, setting that up in these fenced enclosures, digging and carrying heavy dirt and rocks to secure the enclosures. And, there were a few casualties along the way, but through camaraderie and many cookies, we persevered and we managed to erect 4 predator-free soft release enclosures that have sufficient microhabitat available for the lesser night gecko. So they can be released into here and they won't get eaten immediately. So now we had our enclosures and we just needed our geckos. So I hopped on over to Gunner's Coin, which is the island on the left of this photo that's shaped like a triangle, along with half of the island restoration team. And we were there to look for these teeny tiny itty bitty little geckos that blend in seamlessly with their habitat. So no mean feat, but once again, I was with a team of experts that has been working on these islands with these species for many years, so they know exactly where to look. And we were able to successfully capture 120 geckos. And so then the final step was getting the geckos from Gunner's Coin over to Round Island. But remember, Round Island is a closed nature reserve, and we didn't want to accidentally introduce any of the invasive plant species that are on Gunner's Coin to Round Island. So I accompanied the geckos in the helicopter. The helicopter landed, and I didn't get out of the helicopter. I just passed the geckos to the team on the ground, and the helicopter took off. And then it was up to those guys to take the geckos to the enclosures and release them. And then they monitored them every night to make sure that no predators had got into the enclosures. And after, I think, several weeks, once the geckos had a chance to sort of acclimatize, they then did start creating openings in the enclosures so that the geckos could disperse to other areas and the predators could start to come back. And so some of the results from that monitoring showed that they had been laying eggs. So that's a really encouraging result, sort of like early success of its establishment. And hopefully these geckos continue to breed and the population increases so that it can be a viable secondary population on this other island, thereby decreasing the extinction risk of the lesser night gecko and also increasing the resilience of the round island ecosystem by replacing one of those missing pieces. So the island restoration team is already looking at what some of the other missing pieces might be by inventorying invertebrate species like scorpions and cockroaches, as well as looking at plant functional traits just to identify where there's potential to restore some of those ecological linkages. And I feel really grateful to have been able to participate in some of this work and work alongside the people that are making it happen. I have great respect for all of the teams that I worked with, and it's their dedication, their bravery, their ingenuity that makes this all possible. And without the work that they do, a site like this, a giant tortoise laying her nest on Round Island wouldn't happen. And so this leaves me with hope for Mauritius and for other disturbed ecosystems that we can rebuild what has been lost if we're willing to try. And with that, also, thank you.